You stop suffering. The moment you stop explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you, you stop losing energy. The moment you stop performing for people who never deserved access, you stop breaking your own heart. The moment you stop trying to justify your worth to someone who refuses to see it. You want your peace back? Stop explaining. Start observing. You learn a lot about people when you stop telling them who you are and simply watch how they treat you. You learn who values your presence and who only values your usefulness. You learn who listens to understand and who listens just long enough to respond. You learn who shows up willingly and who only shows up when they're afraid of losing you. And the truth hits you slowly, but undeniably. You've been explaining yourself to the wrong people. You've been offering clarity to people who benefit from keeping you confused. You've been giving honesty to people who would rather twist your intentions than face their own behavior. But you don't realize this until the moment you stop talking and start watching. You start noticing things, the patterns, the inconsistencies, the subtle shifts, the things you once overlooked because you were so busy defending yourself. You start noticing how they never misunderstand you when you're doing something for them, only when you need something, only when you set a boundary, only when you ask for clarity. You start noticing how their memory becomes perfect when it benefits them and suddenly selective when the responsibility is theirs. You start noticing how they call you too sensitive when you're hurt, but call you cold when you stop trying. When you stop explaining, you finally see the game. You see the emotional shortcuts they take, the excuses they recycle, the way they weaponize confusion to avoid accountability. You see the way they expect you to read their silence as love, but demand that you express your love with certainty. You see the imbalance, the emotional laziness, the quiet entitlement, the comfort they have in giving you less than they know you deserve. And you see it clearly. Explaining yourself was never the problem. Explaining yourself to the wrong person was, because explaining is not weakness. Explaining is vulnerability. Explaining is openness. Explaining is clarity. But when vulnerability meets someone who lacks emotional maturity, it gets twisted, mocked, dismissed, used against you. So you learn to stop explaining, not out of resentment, not out of anger, not out of coldness, but out of wisdom. You realize something powerful. If someone wants to understand you, they will. If someone cares enough, they'll ask better questions. If someone values you, they'll make clarity happen. But if someone benefits from keeping you off balance, no amount of explaining will ever reach them. So you stop trying. You start observing how they respond when you are no longer available to be their emotional translator. You watch them fumble for the privileges they once had. You watch them grow uncomfortable with the quiet space where your explanations used to be. You watch them lose access to the version of you who overfunctioned just to keep the connection alive. And for the first time, you see who they truly are when they can no longer hide behind your emotional labor. Some people disappear because they cannot survive in an environment where you're not constantly compensating for their lack of effort. Some people pull back because your silence exposes their intentions. Some people become irritated because your calm observation is louder than your explanations ever were. And some people panic, quietly, subtly, internally, because they realize they never expected you to stop pouring yourself out for their comfort. When you stop explaining, you stop giving them material to manipulate. You stop giving them angles to twist, openings to exploit. Emotional details. They can weaponize later. Your silence forces them to face their own behavior. And most people aren't ready for that. You become a mirror that reflects their truth without saying a word. And it's fascinating what people show you when they can no longer hide behind your explanations. You see who takes accountability. You see who doubles down. You see who grows. You see who retreats. You see who is only loyal to the version of you that made their life easier. You learn something freeing. People treat you differently when you stop apologizing for your existence. People reveal themselves when you stop softening your boundaries to protect their feelings. People show you their priorities when you stop adjusting yours to avoid conflict. And people expose their truth when you stop explaining yours. You realize that over-explaining was not a habit. It was a survival strategy, a trauma response, a desperate attempt to prevent abandonment, conflict, misunderstanding, rejection. But now, you don't operate from survival. You operate from clarity. You observe. You analyze. You feel. You watch. You pay attention to actions, not apologetic words. Consistency, not convenience. Patterns, not promises. You stop evaluating people based on potential. You start evaluating them based on reality. Your life becomes quieter, cleaner, easier. And in that stillness, your intuition becomes undeniable. You feel who is genuine. You sense who is empty. You recognize who is draining. You detect who is performing. Your soul returns to you. In the silence you once feared, you begin to understand that the right person doesn't need you to explain why you feel what you feel. The right person creates space for you to feel safe enough to speak only when you want to, because the right person doesn't observe you out of suspicion. They observe you out of care. And the wrong person doesn't misunderstand you because you're unclear. They misunderstand you because clarity threatens them. So you stop explaining. You start observing. And everything begins to shift. When you stop explaining, you stop filling the empty spaces they were supposed to fill. You stop smoothing the edges they were supposed to soften. You stop carrying the emotional weight they were supposed to help you hold. Because explaining gave them the illusion that you owed them something. Your silence reminds them you don't. You begin to notice something powerful. Silence reveals character faster than truth ever could. People reveal who they are when you no longer guide them on how to treat you. You start seeing how little effort some people make when you stop coaching them through every moment. You start seeing how quickly they become distant when you're not constantly reassuring them. You start seeing how their curiosity disappears when they're not the center of every conversation. Your silence disrupts the dynamic they relied on. Because the moment you stop explaining, the emotional playground changes. You're no longer the one trying to maintain harmony. You're no longer the one trying to prevent misunderstandings. You're no longer the one trying to rescue the relationship from their laziness. And the moment you stop carrying it, you see that they were never planning to carry it with you. When you stop explaining, you see who only liked you for the easy version of you. You see who is uncomfortable with your intelligence. You see who is threatened by your clarity. You see who depends on your confusion to maintain their advantage. You see who only felt powerful when you were over-accommodating. Some people don't want understanding. They want control. They don't want clarity. They want excuses. They don't want communication. They want compliance. And you don't see this until you stop feeding them explanations. Your silence exposes their ego. Because when they can't twist your words, When they can't turn your explanations into weapons, they panic. Quietly, subtly, internally. You notice how they suddenly become confused. Only when you set a boundary. You notice how they accuse you of being distant. Only when they stop receiving your emotional labor. You notice that their confusion is selective. Their effort is selective. Their memory is selective. Everything about them was selective, except your giving. When you stop explaining, you stop making excuses for their lack of consistency. You stop convincing yourself that maybe they didn't mean it. You stop rewriting the story to protect their image. Silence is humbling, not for you, for them, because silence removes the illusion that you'll always be available to soothe their insecurities. Silence removes the illusion that you'll always be the one keeping the connection alive. Silence removes the illusion that you'll always fix things. And suddenly, they are forced to face what they've contributed or what they haven't. When you stop explaining, you watch the truth emerge. Slowly, predictably, painfully clear. You see who steps forward without being asked. You see who disappears without an announcement. You see who suddenly has time, effort, and presence now that you're not overgiving. And you see who doesn't fight for you because they never intended to stay. This is the part you don't want to admit. Some people understood you perfectly. They just didn't care. Their confusion wasn't real. It was convenient. Their misunderstandings weren't accidents. They were strategies. Their excuses weren't emotional limitations. They were avoidance mechanisms. And when you stop explaining, you stop participating in the illusion. You see them clearly. For the first time, you see how they needed you to be patient so they could be inconsistent. You see how they needed you to be understanding so they could be careless. You see how they needed you to be forgiving so they didn't have to grow. Your silence breaks that arrangement. And here's what happens next. They start treating your silence like a problem. But your silence is not the problem. Your silence is the truth. It reveals the cracks in their effort. It reveals the limits of their emotional capacity. It reveals the gap between how they talk and how they act. Your silence forces them to choose. Show up or fall away. Effort or excuses. Growth or avoidance. You don't push. You don't argue. You don't chase. You don't over-explain. You observe. That's when their real self steps into the light. Some people will rise fully, clearly, beautifully. They'll show you they were always capable. They just needed the space to prove it. Others will collapse instantly, embarrassingly, because once you remove your emotional support crutches, they have nothing left to stand on. Silence makes everything visible. Who you are to them, who they are to you, what the relationship actually is, beneath the noise. And here's the part that frees you. When you stop explaining, you stop shrinking. You stop bending your truth to fit someone else's comfort. You stop editing yourself just to be tolerable. You stop performing just to be loved. You stop negotiating your value with people who weren't qualified to assess it in the first place. Instead, you start observing. And in that calm, in that stillness, in that sacred internal space, you come back to yourself. You begin to trust yourself again. Your instincts, your sensing, your timing, your emotional intelligence. Because when you stop explaining, your intuition becomes louder. Your inner voice finally has room to speak. And you finally hear the truth you've been avoiding. You were never too sensitive. You were paying attention. You were never too emotional. You were expressive. You were never too much. You were honest. but you were explaining yourself to people who lacked the depth to understand you. Now, you observe, you watch, you listen, you feel, you see clearly. Clarity doesn't come from talking. Clarity comes from watching. And now that you're observing, people can no longer hide. When you stop explaining, you reclaim something you didn't even realize you lost. Your power. Not power over others. Power over yourself. Power over your energy. Your reactions. Your emotional world. Because explaining places your self-worth in someone else's understanding. Observing places your self-worth back in your own awareness. And the moment you make that shift, everything changes. The dynamic changes. The energy changes. The connection changes. But most importantly, you change. When you stop explaining, you stop negotiating your truth with people who refuse to meet you in honesty. You stop trying to convince someone to see you while they're invested in staying blind. You stop asking for respect from someone who benefits from disrespecting you. And when you stop asking, you finally see who was never planning to give anything willingly. Observation reveals intentions that explanations kept hidden. When you observe, you notice the way they speak to you. When they're not trying to impress you, you notice who checks on you only when they need something. You notice who disappears the moment you ask for emotional support. You notice who only shows kindness when they fear your absence. Observing isn't passive. It's powerful. It is the moment you switch from reacting to understanding. And people feel that switch. They feel the stillness. They feel the shift. They feel the distance. Not because you're cold, but because you're no longer available to be emotionally drained. You're watching now, not pleading, not explaining, not chasing, not fixing, watching. And that unsettles people who relied on your emotional labor to hide their lack of effort. Some people crumble when they lose their favorite advantage. You're overgiving without your explanations. They can't pretend they didn't understand. Without your justifications, they can't blame you for their own choices. Without your emotional clarity, they're left alone with their own patterns. And the truth is simple. Some people cannot survive in an environment that requires emotional accountability. Your silence creates that environment. When you stop explaining, you stop being the emotional cushion for someone else's immaturity. You stop being the translator for someone else's avoidance. You stop being the comfort for someone else's contradictions. And people show you exactly who they are without that advantage. Some get angry because silence removes their excuses. Some get distant because effort was never their intention. Some blame you because accountability feels threatening. Some chase you because your absence reveals their attachment. And some rise. Some show up calmly, clearly, genuinely. They don't need explanations. They ask real questions. They take real responsibility. They listen without defensiveness. Those are the ones your silence makes visible, not because your silence is punishment, but because your silence is clarity. Silence filters. It filters the inconsistent, the manipulative, the emotionally lazy. It filters the people who were only loyal to your explanations, not to your truth. When you stop explaining, your boundaries become louder than your words ever were. You begin to see that peace doesn't always come from fixing a relationship. Sometimes peace comes from stopping the chase, stopping the overgiving, stopping the explanations. Observation opens your eyes to what your heart couldn't bear to admit. You were doing all the emotional work. You were carrying the connection. You were sustaining the conversations. You were initiating the repair. You were holding the bond together with sheer effort. And the moment you stop explaining, the moment you stop doing their job too, everything collapses or everything strengthens. There is no in between. If the relationship collapses, it wasn't built, it was carried by you. If the relationship strengthens, it wasn't effort you were missing, it was space. Space for them to show up, space for them to grow, space for them to step in. Observation creates that space. People can no longer hide behind your explanations. When you stop giving them, they rise or they fall. They stay or they go. They invest or they disappear. Your only job is to watch. You watch how they respond. When you stop overfunctioning, you watch how they treat you. When you stop overcommunicating, you watch how they behave. When you stop giving them emotional shortcuts, because when you stop explaining, you stop being predictable, and unpredictability reveals true character. Some people lash out because they cannot control the narrative. Some people withdraw because your silence removes the emotional rewards they used to get for doing nothing. But some people lean in. Some get curious. Some get reflective. Some get sincere. Those are the ones whose presence aligns with your growth. You've changed, they might say. Yes, you stopped explaining, and that changed everything. You stopped begging to be understood. You stopped performing to feel accepted. You stopped arguing with someone who wasn't listening. You started observing, and the more you observe, the less tolerance you have for emotional immaturity. You sense manipulation quicker. You detect dishonesty faster. You feel distance sooner. You notice patterns instantly. Observation sharpens your soul. It gives you perspective. It gives you clarity. It gives you strength. It frees you from the responsibility of making someone else comfortable at the expense of yourself. When you stop explaining, you grow beyond situations you once felt obligated to maintain. You stop chasing the closure they never intended to give. You stop solving problems they deliberately create. You stop watering relationships that refuse to grow. And slowly, beautifully, powerfully, you return to yourself. The self that was silenced, the self that was dismissed, the self that was doubted, the self that was ignored. You come home to the version of you that doesn't need to explain everything to feel worthy. You come home to the version of you that knows your energy is enough proof of your character. And when you live from that place, everything aligns differently. There comes a moment when you finally understand that peace is more important than being understood. That clarity is louder than justification. That the truth doesn't need a sales pitch. It simply needs time. And when you reach that moment, everything inside you starts shifting. You stop trying to convince people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stop running in circles for people who benefit from your confusion. You stop giving long paragraphs to people who respond with excuses because you realize something deep, something life-changing. People reveal more through their patterns than through their words. People show more through their habits than through their promises. People expose their truth, not when you ask them to explain, but when you quietly observe. You begin to see who reaches out without being prompted, who disappears the moment you have needs, who listens when you speak, and who only waits for their turn to talk, who wants connection, and who wants control. You start noticing how they react to your boundaries. Do they respect them, or do they test them? Do they adjust, or do they guilt trip? Do they grow with you, or do they get threatened? When you grow, you start noticing who shows up in clarity and who shows up in chaos, who brings peace and who brings storms. who is consistent, and who is convenient, who chooses you, and who uses you. And as your awareness deepens, so does your power, because your life instantly becomes lighter. The moment you stop explaining and start observing, you stop taking things personally, because you see, the behavior isn't about you, it's about them. You stop absorbing their projections, because you understand. Their reactions reveal their wounds, not your worth. You stop letting their confusion become your responsibility. And without even trying, you become harder to manipulate, harder to gaslight, harder to guilt trip, harder to control, because you're no longer reacting. You're reading patterns. You're no longer chasing answers. You're watching behavior. You're no longer fighting for clarity. You're letting their actions tell the story. And here's the beautiful twist. The moment you start observing, people start revealing themselves faster than ever. Some reveal their loyalty. Some reveal their envy. Some reveal their intentions. Some reveal their emptiness. Some reveal they love you. Some reveal they never did. Observation is truth without effort. It's clarity without conflict. It's wisdom without pain. Unless the truth hurts. And sometimes it will. But that pain will free you. Free you from the wrong people. Free you from wasted energy. Free you from emotional guessing games. Free you from carrying relationships all by yourself. You stop getting attached to potential. You stop romanticizing words. You stop believing promises that never turn into action. You stop falling for connections that drain you. And instead, you begin choosing peace. You begin choosing truth. You begin choosing alignment. You begin choosing yourself. And here's the real magic. When you choose yourself, you naturally attract people who choose you too. People who don't require explanations because they show up with clarity. People who don't drain you because they know how to pour back. People who don't play games because they value connection. People who don't make you anxious because they bring emotional safety with them. That's the reward for shifting from explaining to observing. You become selective. You become grounded. You become calm. You become someone who no longer begs for the bare minimum. You simply notice who can give it and who can't. So stop explaining. Start observing and watch how fast people expose exactly who they are. And watch how fast your life becomes lighter, clearer, calmer, and more aligned with the person you're becoming. The version of you who no longer chases validation. The version of you who no longer needs approval. The version of you who sees everything without demanding anything. This is your power. This is your freedom. This is your awakening. Stop explaining. Start observing. And let the truth speak for itself.